So good morning and good afternoon to our distinguished speakers and members in the audience. I'm Flori Lazier, President and CEO of Corporate Council on Africa, the leading U.S. business association focused solely on connecting business interests in Africa. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us for today's panel discussion titled Accelerating Patient Access to Medicines and Vaccines in Africa. This event is part of CCA's U.S. Africa Health Security and Resilience Initiative. The initiative brings together major U.S. and African leaders, corporations, multilateral organizations, foundations, and other health sector stakeholders to collaborate on developing policies, promoting strategic partnerships, providing critical Africa health-related information, and facilitating investment to strengthen Africa's health security. We are delighted to host today's panel discussion on regulatory harmonization and innovative strategies and best practices for strengthening regulatory systems on the continent to address challenges related to COVID-19 and beyond. To moderate today's panel, I'm delighted to introduce Leah Kaplow, who serves as McKinsey's Associate Partner for the Social Sector Practice. Before I turn it over to Leah, I want to go over some housekeeping rules for the question and answer period. Please use the Zoom chat function to send us your questions. We'll only take questions from those who have provided their name and affiliation. So please do remember when you put your question in the chat to say who you are and who you're with. So without further ado, let me welcome Leah.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. I am Leah Kaplow, an associate partner with McKinsey & Company's Social Sector Practice based in Washington, D.C. I am one of the leaders of our global public health work, where I spend most of my time focusing on health commodity value chains, from local manufacturing to regulation to supply chain and distribution. I'm thrilled to be with you today and to introduce our three distinguished panelists, who I now invite me to join me on video. We are joined by Mrs. Mimi Darko, Dr. Boniface Fundafunda, and Dr. John Mwangi. We will begin with a discussion with our panelists and save some time at the end to open the floor to your questions. Panelists, welcome. Good day to all of you. I ask that each of you introduce yourself as you respond to my first question. The COVID-19 pandemic response triggered increased demand for regulatory resources and systems that were already stretched. How have African regulatory institutions responded? What did we unlock that we didn't think we could? Mimi, why don't I start with you?
Thank you very much. My name is Mimi Darko. I'm currently the Chief Executive of the Food and Drugs Authority in Ghana. I'm also the chairperson for the steering committee of the African Vaccines Regulatory Forum. Just to answer the question, as we know, it is regulators have the least amount of money. But in this pandemic, what actually happened, and happened very quickly, was that we actually came together in Africa very, very quickly. Having already had AVREF, which is the Africa Vaccines Regulatory Forum, established, that was doing joint reviews of clinical trials, we managed to use that same forum to fast track some of the COVID-19 products, which meant that as regulators, we were not putting in our full resources to ensuring that we could make products available. And I think the coming together and working together and evaluating together allowed us to ensure that our population had the needed vaccines and the needed therapies. And also we could then put our resources into other things like monitoring safety and, interestingly, communication. So that would be my first response for this question. We unlocked the ability to come together and to work quickly within a certain time frame to make the necessary medicines available as regulators. Thank you.
Boniface, over to you, and maybe you can build on Mimi's response and highlight some of the things that in practice truly felt different in the last 18 months.
Yes, thank you. My name is Boniface Afunda. I'm the interim chief executive for Africa Resource Center. I'm based here in Lusaka in Zambia, and I've got a few years of experience in working with regulatory authorities as a service provider from the supply chain perspective. I think I concur with Deleuze when she mentions that the regulators came together and there was actual harmonization, which I think in the past was almost seen as impossible to do unless you have like two countries agreeing to harmonize. So I think the mere fact that institutions came together and they trusted each other and they were able to actually take action that was relevant to make the product available, I think that for me was quite a game changer in terms of the way regulatory affairs is seen within public health. And I think that's something to build on. Over to you.
John, as you respond, maybe you can highlight from the private sector perspective what felt different this time.
Thank you. My name is John Mwangi. I am currently a co-chair of the Africa Regulatory Network, which is a group of us within the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Association, otherwise called IFPMA, that looks at the topics within the continent of Africa. When the pandemic started, we saw, like my colleagues have indicated, a lot of collaboration going from industry to other stakeholders and to the health authorities. And it was a good picture seeing that everyone pulled in one direction. Besides the COVID, let's say, vaccine and diagnostics, we also saw a lot of efforts going towards all the other medicines and devices and medical products in a way that enabled most countries continue having those products available for the populations that they serve in the respective countries. One thing that stood out was also the fact that the regulators opened up to using what we call the risk-based approach, which means in certain instances, we even had cases of using what we call rolling basis of submission. In other words, even if all the information was not available, the regulators were open to start receiving the information which was available and sort of save the time at the end of the day, which would be needed to realize regulatory decisions. One more thing was also, which was also an interesting observation, was the fact that a lot of the requirements that we in regulatory and the regulators alike put together and always following them were put to question whether they are all always relevant for purposes of quality and safety monitoring of the product. And indeed, everyone agreed that some of them could actually be kept aside for purposes of ensuring that the products were available for the patients that needed them. And this went beyond the COVID products, but also to all the other products that are needed by the patient. So that was, by way of introduction, what we saw during the pandemic.
I'd love to think, as you started taking us there, John, how this goes beyond COVID, right? I think it's one thing to think, okay, countries, regulators coming together in a time of existential crisis. And would love to ask, what have we created that you think actually can institutionalize and exist beyond this pandemic? And what actually felt more like a one-time thing that was relevant now, but we may lose as time goes on, or may not be relevant as time goes on? Mimi, I'll start again with you.
Okay, so John actually mentioned something that I had been going to mention. So yes, so normally we have used a risk-based approach, but it was a product-specific risk-based approach. So we would say that if there was a product that was submitted for a public health disease, we would use a risk-based approach, we would fast track it, etc. But what we did during the pandemic was that we used that risk more on a process base. So it was more like, I would say, a risk-based approach, but in the process. So we had never done a rolling submission. We would wait for everything to be intact before we would give you an approval. Things like stability data, you needed to make sure you're done at least 6 months accelerated, and at least show us 1 year of long term. But we realized that industry as well cooperated, because before our fear was if we didn't have everything as and when we, at the time of authorization, it would be difficult to get it when the time got nearer. But we have decided, and I was actually having a meeting a few months ago with my staff, where we've actually now moved this approach into everything else that we do. So using the risk-based approach and the rolling submission and evaluation mechanism is something that is going to stay, at least for us, because it allows you to evaluate quickly, make the product available. And every product is critical. It's not just in a pandemic. There's somebody out there who needs the product. So it is not just when everybody needs it that we have to use that approach. And with collaboration, and it is very important from industry, where we do not have to go back to industry and ask that, it is time to submit this document, where industry also, ups their game and submits it when it is supposed to submit. I think this particular strategy is something that will stay. And it is something that, as John said, allows us to free our time to start certain activities on time, like monitoring the safety of the products right at the beginning and not wait till, how many years down the line. So that is something that will definitely stay with us. Thank you.
Maybe a follow-up for you. You're not just speaking as the CEO of a national regulator, you're speaking as the CEO of one of 2 African national regulatory authorities that has WHO Maturity Level 3 certification. How do you see this response, as well as the look forward and changes that regulators may be making, differ across regulatory authorities on the continent?
So regulatory authorities on the continent, I would say, even though we are maturity level 3, the drive for others to put those systems in place. Because fortunately for us, we started our assessment, so our benchmarking just before COVID, and we got our maturity level 3 during COVID, now bang in the middle of COVID. But what we realized was that the systems and that we put in place to become maturity level 3 was actually one of the driving forces of how well we did during COVID. And so I don't believe it is just talking from my perspective, but because I chair some of these bodies, and because I am part of these bodies, I've seen that the harmonization drive, the drive to use the risk-based approach is something that all other regulators are looking to do. It is actually a much more beneficial or judicial use of resources. An example was that when we were doing the COVID evaluation, because we had to have speed, instead of us having normally, and I know it is happening in a lot of countries now, you have a dossier, one person reviews it, gives it to another person to peer review, and it goes on. But now what we had to do during COVID was that we had to now split a document into different portions. So if somebody had expertise in a certain area, they would review the clinical, somebody reviewed the quality, and it came together. Comprehensively, we did a much better job. And it is along those functions that we've realized that we can actually work better using that approach. And because we are actually harmonizing in our different regional economic blocks, all the best practices are spreading across the other agencies. And so I think that it is something that the best practices during harmonization, the harmonization process will be picked up by all the other regulatory agencies. So I don't think there's going to be a coming back or a sitting, a laid back approach anymore, that difficult approach that we had before towards authorizing products. I doubt we're going to be coming that way in the future after this pandemic. Thank you.
This sounds like a lot of things moving in the right direction, perhaps spurred by the pandemic and revealed by the pandemic, but things that maybe should have been happening anyway. John, can you speak to some of the constraints that you still see, especially from the perspective of industry, as they are trying to get involved in this process and trying to comply with the requirements of the regulatory bodies on the continent?
On one hand, I think we've seen quite some good progress in terms of harmonizing requirements, especially the technical requirements. On the other hand, we have a little bit of what we call administrative requirements, which are still not there yet, meaning that as much as you end up having the better part of what is required being harmonized, we still have an element which also affects the timelines of getting regulatory submissions and approvals through. And this is something that we as industry, as well as the regulators, are constantly in dialogue on, and I think we are seeing some improvements on that, but that remains one of the challenges. The other thing also is awareness. A lot of the harmonization activities so far is, of course, originating from the regulatory authorities. And there is now the need to roll it out more to the industry, bring it closer, offer sessions for asking questions and interacting so that industry and other players better understand these new ways of working, so that they are not seen as pilots, but they are seen as the new way of working, which actually, for the few that have been applied, it has been shown that they actually save time and there are better regulatory outcomes. Another thing also concerns resources, because so far, at the setup of the harmonization initiatives that we see in the regions, a lot of it is donor-driven, donor-funded, but it reaches a point where then the countries are taking it up, meaning the countries have to make a choice between allocating the little resources they have to the national activities that they still have to continue with, such as post-marketing surveillance in their borders, and also contribute towards the regional activities and offering more sessions for evaluations to be done. There is also a bit of a disconnect between the positive or the response that you get from, let's say what we call the joint assessment sessions, and how you actually realize that to become a product registration in the country. Because for the product to actually physically be available in the country, you still have to go to the national agencies for you to get the approval, because the current legal framework does not as yet allow for regional, let's say, marketing authorization issuance. And for that reason, certain countries are at different levels of, making this process to flow smoothly. And finally, and very important aspect that, again, it's a point of dialogue with the regulators and the other stakeholders, is how to handle post-approval changes. Meaning, after approval of one product, having what we call one dossier, the product goes through changes at the end of the day that, to improve on its quality, attributes, or to bring in new elements. And that means that the dossier then needs to be varied. And that process is currently not harmonized. So you get approval from a central, let's say, evaluation, but once 2 months later, when there is a change, then the product has to be subjected to a national process. Of course, everything has to be done step by step, and we appreciate that so far the capacity has been built around what we call new drug application and introducing new products into the market. But the next step, where also quite some dialogue and investment is required, is to tie in the element of what we call post-approval changes, so that the aspiration of one dossier is actually realized 5 years, 10 years down the line after the product has been introduced into the market. Allow me to mention one thing, which is also something we saw working very well previously. And this is concerning use of electronic systems. We, as industry, for instance, did a small survey during the pandemic, and we saw that there were two groups of countries: those that were electronically enabled and those that were not electronically enabled. And on one extreme, we saw even increase in the speed of responses from some of the countries which were fully working online via emails and submission portals. And on the other hand, we saw some countries coming to a complete stop simply because there was no way to communicate, because the only way to for the authorities to work with the industry was via physical meetings and physical submission. So that is something which, for me, and we look at it as a low-hanging fruit that can actually be, realized by all the stakeholders to migrate towards the electronic way of working in whatever form. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that comprehensive list. I think we should dive into a couple of those topics. Maybe Boniface, you can start us off on this awareness topic, and what are you seeing as some of the biggest constraints for private sector actually understanding the rules of the game as those rules evolve? And is there anything you would add to John's ideas around what the regulatory bodies can do to help improve that awareness?
Yes, I hope you can hear me. I think I've always seen regulators, part of their job is education. I think within the pharmaceutical or medical industry, we can't take it for granted that the industry is fully aware and on top of all the regulatory requirements, and particularly understanding the purpose of regulation. Quite often you get this situation whereby some people in industry want to get waivers because it is possible to get a waiver. They want or they expect a certain process to be done so fast because they just think it's a technical process. It should take a very short period of time. So I think where regulators are actively working with industry and bringing up to speed industry players to fully understand why regulation is there, what the purpose of regulation is. I think that's where you get a finer working arrangement and a finer working partnership between the industry as well as regulators. So I think that's one set of awareness that I think we need to focus on. The other one is really the political side of medicines and access to medicine. Here we are talking very much around the technicalities of regulation, harmonization. I mean, within the cluster of regulators, that is possible to do. I think harmonization will be done and it will be possible. On the one hand, that still remains of concern is the political environment in which regulation exists, because the decision makers among politicians are not necessarily regulators. They are not necessarily people who understand what we understand about the services done through harmonization, for example. So you'll find that there's a huge pressure on regulators to kind of take on and demonstrate ownership of the regulatory process, even within the harmonization environment. So you will find that beyond the Ministry of Health, there will be other ministers, other politicians who will not understand the purpose of harmonization. What does that do in terms of liabilities and risk to the patient, et cetera, when a product has been processed in another country, but we're just sharing data, and the results. So again, that sort of education from regulators to both industry as well as politicians and policymakers, I think that is really something that is will be very key in terms of going forward and making sure that we kind of don't fall back and begin to move away from harmonization. Thank you.
Thanks, Boniface. I think let's turn to speak a little bit more explicitly about the harmonization topic, which many of you have been bringing up. And Mimi, I'll probably come to you for this to start us off. Maybe you can start with a little bit of just a description of the current state and what are some of the big initiatives that are ongoing for those of our listeners who may not be aware. We have seen unprecedented new levels of regional collaboration and harmonization, both through COVID, but even before, with the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiatives, or AMRH. So maybe you can tell everyone a little bit more about what's actually going on, and pick up on any of these threads that your colleagues have been mentioning around some of the emerging challenges or maybe outstanding work to be done, shall we say.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. I mean, it's interesting. It's like we're all in the same boat. For harmonization, you're right, because we have different regulatory systems. There's some agencies that are still desks within the Ministry of Health. There are some of us that are agencies of the Ministry of Health, so we have some level of autonomy. There are some agencies that have their systems is such that even after doing an authorization, it has to go through certain expert groups, within the ministry before you get approval. So we could harmonize our technical requirements, yes, and with that, for example, if I use AVREF as an example, we've put together some guidelines for review of, say, clinical trials that is used within all the AVREF countries. And we've tried to domesticate these within the countries. But when it comes to processes, that is where we have some of the challenges, because we can use the same harmonized documents. But as John said, once you do a joint review, there are still, every country is a sovereign country within any particular system. So there would be administrative requirements that, sometimes it's a label requirement. Sometimes I have to, go back and speak to an external, an expert committee. Those are some of the challenges that you come by. He talked about variation, but variation can use the same system that a submission does. And that is one of the things that we're talking about. So if there's an authorization, if there's a variation to a product, we would have to go back into the same, using that same joint process. But currently, what the Africa Union and within which is acting as a coordinator for the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization is doing is that we are all looking at the Africa Union model law for medical regulation of medical products. And we are all trying to adopt that model law, which then for countries that have a system, a robust enough system, you just look and make sure that it is aligned with the model law. For countries that don't, that would require the legislation, the guidelines, etc. They are looking to adopting and domesticating the Africa Union model law, which would then allow us to be operating along the same, using similar legislation, similar processes, and then we come to the harmonizing the documents themselves. It makes it a little bit easier. But with that, I'm sure you've heard about the African Medicines Agency, where we now have 16 countries that have ratified. So basically it has been officially, come into force. We just have some administrative and other, legal things to do. But even within that, we would be having working groups for different functions, whether it is authorization, whether it is biologics, whether it's medical devices. But we still need to realize that even after doing all that, countries would then go back, into their, or members will go back into their countries and would now have to authorize. That is going to stay the same. It is only a recommendation for approval. We then go back into our countries and issue, the usual registration numbers. What we need to come together and do is that we need to agree on timelines. That is very important. And that is what we have done over the years with AVREF. When we have a joint review, we don't go back and go and sit. We have specific timelines. Now, if we agreed on such timelines, and one thing I also need to mention to John is that sometimes the delay doesn't always come from the regulator. Sometimes it comes from industry. And so industry also needs to play its part. So if we finish a review and we go back and the country has a specific requirement or there's a question that has been asked, sometimes there are delays on the industry side. So harmonization, coming together to harmonize our activities is between regulation and industry. With support from partners, but it cannot be done by regulation alone. And we harmonize certain activities, but we need to remember that the more important activities, like the safety monitoring, like the looking out for counterfeits, like the quality monitoring, is left to the countries to do. And those are areas where countries need to build up capacity, need to be supported. Industry needs to ensure that if we go into a joint review or we authorize a product as a one body, the necessary information on whether it is counterfeiting, whether it's adverse events, should come to regulatory. And sometimes that is a challenge. And so sometimes I understand when countries want to make sure that they have everything before they move. Authorization is not a difficult thing to do in a joint mode, but post-authorization, and especially in this era where we are fast-tracking applications, that part of it needs to be looked at very carefully, and industry would have to collaborate very well. There are times when we found adverse events have been reported in certain jurisdictions and have not been reported to some of our countries. So it is a partnership to ensure that this works, and that is what I can say for now. Thank you.
I definitely want to come back to this question of what can industry better do as a partner in this process. Maybe sticking with the harmonization process for a moment. And Mimi, I'll come back to you first and then move to others. It's clear from your response that there are some activities that can be harmonized, some activities that may never be harmonized or indeed should not be harmonized. Where is there still room to grow and improve and expand harmonization beyond where we are today? What do you see as there continually being appetite for?
I would say that we talked about regulators being educated. So if you talk about, John was mentioning online, the online submissions, etc. They're things that cost money. And for most regulatory authorities within our regions, I mean, we have recently only put, I mean, you can submit things by email, but to have a fully automated electronic system costs a lot of money. And these are things that would delay some of the processes. I mean, like, you know, we cannot be as efficient as we would wish to be, and not all the countries can. Where are we now? We are in a good place, I would say, but we need the support of industry. Industry needs to allow this process to happen. Industry needs to support this process to happen. If you have a small country that industry, John, excuse me if I have to say that industry has to play fair, and industry has to play fair across the entire, whether it is a big country, whether it is a stringent agency like Ghana, whether it is a not so stringent, industry has to play fair across the continuum of all regulators, so that that trust is built. So a country knows that if I have gone through this process where authorization is safe, if I go back, will I have all the information that I need to move on? You know, or, you know, if I go back and there's an issue with quality, will I get the information that I need? If there's an issue with safety, even with safety, we are trying to come together with what we call the Africa Union Smart Safety Surveillance, where we all put all our safety data into one basket, and then we can mine it and look at it. But those systems have to be built. And so when countries have laws that say that industry is responsible to ensuring that the safety of a product is reported, or any adverse events are reported, we would ask that those adverse events are reported, and we do not need to see them somewhere else. If we ask that industry needs to nominate somebody specifically in the country or specifically in the region to monitor, I would say country, to monitor the adverse events, or at least report, industry needs to do that. In Ghana, we have a system where we have a qualified person for pharmacovigilance, and we insist that every marketing authorization holder is responsible for the products they put on the market. It has to be across board. So the countries are confident that once I do this joint evaluation, or I do this centralized procedure, when I go back to my country, where I am an individual, I'm an individual country, and I have my own peculiar experiences, I have the support of industry. And that if there's anything that is going wrong, industry will tell me. And industry has to tell me directly, and industry has to tell me in the timely manner within which I authorize the product. And those are the ways that industry can support us, by doing what it's done in other jurisdictions, in our jurisdictions, in the same timely manner. It is a matter of confidence. The reason why sometimes countries are not quick to go into a basket is because you go into a basket, yes, for a period, but you come out and you're on your own. And will I get that support from industry? So it is a two-way thing. We are giving some, and I think in certain areas, industry can also give to ensure that the process moves forward. Thank you.
So John, let me come back to you. Would love to hear your reaction to this list of asks of industry, but also if there are other asks that you think industry has of the regulatory system in terms of increased harmonization, or other areas where you think that the community is hoping for continued change and progress. We would love to hear that.
Yes, indeed, and I'm fully in agreement with what Mimi has said, that we as industry also show up with the commitment to do what is right and to treat all fairly, and to build, to be as part of the stakeholders, to build trust with all the stakeholders that we work with in all the countries. In fact, the way we see here, or the way I see the role of industry also could be what I would call the conduit of generous sharing of best practices, because industry is also having experience among many countries. And this could be a positive thing also, because we could bring those learnings that we have picked from other regions, for instance, and try to apply them here. Of course, we have to be sensitive to the journey that Mimi has mentioned, that we have to walk step by step. And I think we're getting there together with the regulators and to build this environment of trust. And trust takes time to be built, and we have to walk that journey. So for us as industry, as one practical thing also for us to do is to be a good consumer for all the initiatives and all the let's say the possibilities that are presented also by our regulators in the continent. We as industry, for instance, have to be proactively participating in pilots that are trying to look at new ways of working, and not to be a spectator and wait, but also be there and take the risk and the chance to work with the regulator, run a pilot, take the lessons together. And on the other hand, also a call for everyone else is, let's walk this journey together. Let's involve all stakeholders early enough. I will not say probably at the same time, but also to bring in industry at the right time, but possibly early enough, because that way, then industry also gets them to understand the process, to understand the system, to make internal adjustments, so that we are also getting to be better consumers of what the regulators are putting together and all the investments that are coming up, especially if you think about also using the online platforms. Also for us as industry to be patient to walk the journey with our regulators, for instance, to build these electronic systems as an example, from handling one element of the regulation to covering several of them, as we've seen in some of the countries actually this happening. And for the regulators to really know that these systems work, the industry has to really apply themselves and be responsive to the questions and the demands of the regulators. Thank you.
Boniface, maybe you can speak a little bit to any best practices or learnings that you've witnessed in this industry regulator collaboration that we're all talking about right now. Anything we can point to as inspiration?
I think maybe it follows on to what John is saying, that on the part of industry, it's basically testing regulatory affairs across countries. I think, investing in that sort of activity by industry to ensure to test all the parameters that exist in one country, where you want to trade. For example, if you're based in Kenya, you want to trade maybe, I don't know, you could want to trade in Zambia, for example, you want to test that sort of environment from a regulatory perspective. So that needs to be done. And following all of those elements that exist, say, in a country like Zambia by an industry player in Kenya, I think that is good practice, because the risk we often see is people will say, well, I'm coming from this country where we've got a fairly stringent process. If I'm going to another country, I don't have to maybe comply or expect a lot of demand on me, because that country hasn't got the required all the regulatory steps in place. So I think good practice requires, I would say, that you are compliant, you fully understand what the requirements are, and you're compliant with those requirements, and you basically do better than maybe what you find in that country in terms of submissions and so forth. So I would say, from just observing some of the industry players, that's what I've seen. But I think also the fact that a regulator can take it upon themselves and say, we need to educate our industry in order to create this partnership that what Mimi and John are speaking about. I think, industry has to meet with regulators, and regulators have to meet with industry, and have that educating kind of process in place to kind of talk about the requirements or obligations and so forth. So I think good practice, applies to both entities, the regulators as well as the industry players. Thank you.
We've been talking about industry as a monolith for the last couple of minutes, and I'm wondering if anyone wants to speak to any nuance that you see between different types of companies, whether it's different types of products are generics, different from new products, biologics different from small molecules for this, pharmaceuticals different from medical devices, is there any difference in terms of who the company is and where they're based? If it's a local African institution, whether it's a multinational company with a footprint on the continent, or actually a fully external company, whether there's any difference in their experience in going through this system and the role that you think that they can play. Maybe Mimi, I'll start with you.
Yes, I mean, I was talking about if we look at the different kinds of industries, even for the Africa Medicines Agency, when we do start our working groups, we actually even looking because the idea is to have experts from countries review certain documents that we may not all have the expertise from. We'll be starting with the larger, what we call in companies that make the new products. So those are the things that we will be looking at for a start, to ensure that within the continent, you do not lose out for getting a product because you do not have the capacity to review it. So that is the bottom line, bringing the experts together. So certain things like generics, that have been on the market for a long time will not even be the first group of products that would be going. And that is how, even with the harmonization, we have been working. So looking at things that may be of immediate public health needs, things that are new, like biologics, like monoclonal antibodies, etc. Where quality is concerned and where reviews are concerned, it doesn't matter where the company is. Quality is quality and safety is safety. The review is the same. The only difference that I would see immediately is that, well, if the company has a footprint, or the industry has a footprint within a particular jurisdiction, so it could be in one of the countries. When we start, we can actually rely on so normally what happens now is that if you register a product, you would go and do a GMP inspection wherever it is that the product is coming from, unless for some of us, we clearly state that if it is in a certain region, you don't need to inspect. Now, if the company is within, say, the Africa region, or within any of the countries within the Africa region, we are looking at a GMP working group, so that if a country has actually inspected a particular facility, it is assume that we can rely on the information, because there's going to be a lot of reliance within this process, which then makes it a lot faster than where we have a company that is, say, somewhere else where nobody has actually been to inspect it. So where processes are concerned, it may be a lot quicker. I mean, if it is say a company in South Africa has inspected it, we then all decided we rely on South Africa's inspection, because the company is there. They ensure that they are manufacturing according to good manufacturing practices, and we all accept it. If the company is in another region, we should say any of the ICH regions, because we are harmonizing our systems, we can all say that, well, for such companies, we will rely on ABC's inspection, or we rely on ABC's documentation. The challenge then comes when we have to do with counterfeits and substandard products. But what we also think is that if we are reviewing by the same mechanisms, and we are we need to then follow up with the same mechanism, and that has been one of the things that we have been thinking about. How do we ensure that we are safe after a product has been authorized to be put on our market? How do we ensure our borders are well controlled? If it is within it is a tough question. I mean, if you have a footprint in there, I would say that just make sure that we get the information that we need in a timely manner, and it is always a timely manner. And I will continue afterwards. I hand over to someone.
Boniface, anything you would add in terms of differences that companies may feel in terms of their relationship, their experience working with regulators?
Well, I think, that's been something that we have observed over the years, where you find, very well-established companies with their portfolio of products across the continent. They would say, we are so well-established, we are so well-regulated, you need to trust us. But I think, as Nene is saying, the regulatory responsibilities should still apply for any product from any company. Particularly when we talk about generic products, because over many years, there's been all kinds of discussions around what sort of allowances we should give to the generic industry or generic medicines manufacturers. But I think one thing what often is forgotten is that if we have to provide confidence in a product from a patient perspective, we have to apply the same regulatory rigor to generic products. So it shouldn't matter whether the company is a very well established, company with a huge portfolio of brands and patented products all over the place, as you would apply to, say, a generic industry on the African continent, manufacturing those kind of lines. So, because at the end of the day, it's trust and confidence in the product and its function and activity in the human body, and the safety element comes into there. So we can't, I would say, have one process for one company and another process for another. So I think that's what I would comment on that. Thank you.
John, anything you would add from industry perspective? Differences, how companies may engage differently?
Yes, indeed. I would say, like my colleagues have said here, at the end of the day, it's the same quality, it's the same safety. But depending on the kind of product that we're talking about here, then you tend to see that there could be differences. I just want to pick two examples, for instance, for the so-called, let's say, originator products or originator companies that are doing R&D based kind of products. It means that if we were to only target the country-based mechanism, it will take us very long for us to create capacity to be able to, as a continent, to steward those products correctly. But now with the regional activities and now going towards AMA and the continental approach, we actually see, a very good positive way to bring these products into into markets like the ones we have in Africa, where we can actually get capacity being built at the continental or regional level. And this, in my view, also increases the speed of bringing these products into Africa. And the other thing also is to consider an opportunity here for, following practices like we mentioned, reliance and work sharing that allows that such products can actually be jointly, looked at rather than at the country level. So that movement from country to regional to continental is actually providing a very good shift for this kind of products. The other thing, which is just a slight difference, would also be, the whole idea for bioequivalence testing, which in most countries, we currently don't have that, and that affects the generics manufacturers. And this is something that as we move towards the regional approach and continental approach, it then makes it easier to build that capacity. And back to what Boniface said, no wonder then we can reach a place where also the products being manufactured and developed from Africa, for that matter, can actually reach the same standard as those products from elsewhere in the world. And that puts Africa in a better place compared to where we are coming from in the past. That would be my take for that.
A number of you now have mentioned the national, regional, continental, in the vein of speaking about the African Medicines Agency, which in June, I believe Cameroon became the 15th Africa Union member state to ratify the African Medicines Agency, which pushed the AMA over the required threshold for the agency to actually become institutionalized. So we've been dancing around this a little bit, but I would love your take on both what you hope the impact will be of having an African Medicines Agency, and also what some of the outstanding questions you have are as to how that will work and what the impact may actually be realized. John, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. If we speak about specifically now having one entity for the continent, my industry aspiration, and I guess shared by many other stakeholders, is to have what we call one dossier for Africa. Of course, it's easier said than done, because like Mimi said, there will be still those national things that you still need to take care of. But that's a good aspiration that I think we should all have. Another thing that ideally should happen is a good synergy with other continental bodies and other continental approaches that we are seeing. if we, for instance, on one hand, have Africa Medicines Agency coming to be, and on the other hand, we're talking about a free trade area for the continent, you can see the good connection that these two aspects would have. Of course, we need the political goodwill to make sure that once you have this one dossier that I speak about here, that particular dossier and the product it speaks to can actually easily move from one country to another. And you know what that would lead to? Would actually lead to the concept where we start to see Africa not as 54 fragmented, often economically not very viable units as far as including producing products for the people, to some regional as well as continental approach that actually can makes economic sense. In fact, also to make some economic investments here to develop and make products also for Africa. So that's one thing. So we really need to see in reality that there will be free movement of goods as much as we have one product coming up for Africa. What remains to be seen how this will work, for instance, if I speak into this as far as AMA is concerned, is how will this work in real life? How shall we transition, for instance, from national to regional to AMA? And I know not everything will transition that way. Some things, for instance, post-market surveillance will remain at the country. How shall we be able to manage this change as all stakeholders and make sure that we have continuity of supply of products, for instance? Where will this AMA be based? How will it be funded? How will it be resourced? Those are questions that all of us should, actively engage in and provide contribution as we move now towards the next step of realizing AMA, but also not forgetting all the other aspects that come with AMA and what needs to be in place. I just talked about free trade area, also the conversations that are going on as far as Africa CDC is concerned and all the activities that we are seeing in that line. This needs to speak to each other and nothing of this needs to speak in isolation. Above all, I think one of the very important thing is to involve all the stakeholders early enough. As we set up AMA, for instance, let's start right by involving all stakeholders, industry included, so that we are creating a system in place which is fit for purpose. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Boniface, over to you. Any additional aspirations or what you hope the benefit of AMA will be, and any big concerns or questions that you have?
I think certainly AMA will create the sort of efficiencies in access to medicines that one would expect if we can set these things right. The free movement of goods, within the Africa Free Trade Arrangement, supported by a common regulatory kind of framework, I think that should help with trade. It should help with the business of, moving goods across the continent without concerns that would arise otherwise. But I think, as John is saying, this has to be set right. We need to ensure that all the stakeholders are on board. We need to have assurance that performance will be such that trade will be possible, particularly to have, to enable responses such as the ability to move goods quickly, to either because we are responding to an emergency or simply because the arrangements that we are putting in place providing that promise that goods will move with kind of oversight across all the countries based on that common arrangement. So I think that is something that I would expect to see happen with this kind of harmonized framework. Thank you.
Mimi, over to you. Thoughts on AMA?
Oh, AMA, yes. We're all waiting for AMA. What I think is that the best thing that for me I see is because they are harmonized requirements and they are harmonized reviews, which is also very important. You can have the harmonized requirements, but in different countries, the reviews are done differently. And therefore, things that one country will not allow to slip, another country may. And when that happens, if goods are moving freely, across the countries, you may have different quality goods. So I may decide that this is not good enough for me, and somebody else may accept it. So for me, for AMA and the general harmonization process, The reviews, the similar quality of reviews is very important, not just the similar quality of requirements or the similar requirements. And I mean, AMA is good for all of us because at the end of the day, for industry, it improves on the ease of doing business. Things get done much quicker, things get done more broadly, you know, so we, for us as regulators, as I said earlier, we managed to get within that context to get products for all our countries for the benefits of our people. As John and Boniface said, there will always be the little things that, I mean, the peculiar things that some countries may require, but we are hoping that as we move on, those become the minority, and you know, those are just the little things on say a label that somebody requires because of, you know, ABC, but the general technical requirements that have to do with quality, safety, and efficacy will be harmonized. The reviews will be the same, so the product that actually comes out is the same. We now then need to look at the other things that come afterwards and how we can harmonize those as well. And within AMA, we have the market surveillance, you know, post-market surveillance working group. We have the safety working group. So at the end of the day, hopefully with AMA, if there is an issue with a product on the market, we will all hear about it. If industry informs us, you know, it is not just one country, but hopefully we all know about it, and we all in our individual countries then start looking out and sharing this information, and the same with safety. So I think eventually we will move from just authorizing and move within AMA to also ensuring quality and safety of products with the support of industry. Making sure that it is at the end of the day, it's all based on having the right information at the right time. So if we can get this information also from industry to all of us at the same time, then we're all looking out for the same things. We're all speaking to each other about what we have seen, and we have used the same word, trust and confidence. That is where it is built. And for us regulators, that is, even after we've put, you know, authorized things on the market, our work doesn't stop. And there's always the thought of your government's breathing down your necks that you've allowed this product, even for COVID. You've allowed this vaccine onto the market. And I've suddenly heard in Europe that the vaccine is not safe. What are you doing here? Was it a safe vaccine that you actually allowed us to have? If Europe would let us have the information, just as an example, on time, then we can process it and then inform our government. So I'm thinking that with this harmonized system, as John said, it would also link us closer to other harmonization initiatives. Say the EMA will be a lot closer to them as a group, so that if there's information on that side that we have to know about, we all know about it, and we can all move it, evaluate it, get it at the right time, and inform our governments that, look, as a group, we've looked at this, and we have information from the EMA, we have information from PAHO, we have information from everybody, and we take similar decisions as relates to our population. So I have a very positive feeling about AMA, not just for authorization, but for everything else, that we will get move in the right direction. And then our differences will come closer to become similarities rather than remain different. Thank you.
And quite a clear theme from you, Mimi, on both in terms of how industry can collaborate and in terms of what may be possible from a harmonization perspective while maintaining national sovereignty and national activities, that it's not just about registration and a product approval, that really post-market, there's quite a need for strengthening there, that a lot of energy has been paid on pre-market work. And some of the harmonization both frees up the opportunity for national regulators to spend time on post-market, but also there may be some opportunities from the harmonization work that can contribute to those initiatives. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'd love to open it up to questions from our audience. And please write your question in the chat, including briefly in just 2 words telling us what organization you are representing. I will get us started with a couple of questions that have already come through, which are really coming back to this question on digitization. We heard clearly from John the ask for digital systems, electronic submission, email communication, and for Mimi, the challenge that that presents in terms of the resourcing that it requires to practically both set up but then maintain those systems. And so we've had a couple of questions from the chat box around how can industry actually support on digitization efforts? And are there ways for industry to help bridge the digital divide and support regulators in technological advancement? So maybe, John, I'll start with you.
One thing, for instance, as far as electronic systems are concerned, there's one thing of the resources required for that, and that's for sure something significant. There is a possibility, for instance, to start small, start with the main aspects that are being regulated by the regulatory bodies, and then scale upwards. But in doing so, there also needs to be a blueprint of these systems. One other thing is maybe countries can also, especially at the regional level, start to build regional systems where maybe they also pull resources for that. And maybe there is a potential for those systems to interoperate with each other between countries, because that also becomes a platform for work sharing, like we say. On the other hand, for industry also has to take it up and apply themselves to use these systems as they get developed. On the other hand, also provide feedback on how the system works and share experiences from elsewhere. Of course, with an expectation that each country has its own unique capabilities, and we have to walk step by step, but also sharing what is working elsewhere with a view to, let's say, make the learning curve to be less steep. And I think if we start that way, then we will get somewhere, ultimately.
Boniface, anything you would add about what can actually be done to support the development of these systems?
I think maybe just following on to what John has said, I think it's basically committing to looking at what technology can do in terms of creating efficiencies in processes, because we are agreed that it won't be every process that needs to be put on an electronic platform. But I think starting in sections of the processes that can create efficiencies, and particularly where it comes to sharing information, even between regulators and industry, by use of just the electronic system, I think that is another area of improvement that can be done in this area. Thank you.
Any thoughts from you on digitization?
I think it's a good thing. COVID has shown us that it is a good thing. And it is a good thing not just for authorization, it's a good thing for safety. If I talked about the AU3S, it has built a certain level of confidence where I know that if I'm seeing a safety issue in my country post-evaluation or post-authorization, there's a database where I can push my safety information in and I can mine the data and I know what is happening in another country. So you don't feel isolated. With digitization, you actually don't feel isolated. You feel connected to everyone. Industry can help. I remember some time ago, we were trying to digitalize and we knew about an E2B system, but that system is not compliant everywhere. So maybe industry can talk among themselves. As regulators, we have certain conflicts of interest where we cannot, there's about so far that we can go, but there are partners that are supporting some of these processes. So industry can come together and work with some of these partners and see how, to support the AMA process, see how we can have one, and very quickly, because what is happening is that we are all building our online systems. And we're going to probably end up with systems that are not compliant with each other. So as very quickly as possible, if industry sees the benefit of having a digitalized system, industry needs to come together and let us know quickly before we spend the funds that we don't have, doing the little that we think we can do to have online systems, and then find out somewhere down the line that it is not compatible with anybody at all, or it's compatible with only a few. So those are some of the things that industry can do. There's a basket of partners that are supporting some of these processes for those of us who are starting, for the AMA, for the AMRH. Industry should come together with them first to see how we can move this forward, because as I said, it allows you to feel connected. And as regulators, the worst thing you can feel is isolated, even though we were working like that before. Harmonization has taught us that it feels more comfortable knowing that, you're hooked into, linked to somebody else within your region, can speak easily, can share information easily, but we have to all build along the same lines, our online systems. So I think industry should take the initiative and speak to some of the people who are supporting these processes and see how best you can help us before we go a long way and realize that we have spent unnecessary funds or spent funds into a system that, it does not support as many as possible. So that's how I think industry can support.
Great. And fear not, participants, I am covering the questions in the chat, so we will not be missing. There was a question around the role of the WHO in all of this. We've been focused really on African institutions and industry. But what role does the WHO have to play in terms of both supporting harmonization, but also in helping bridge some of the technological divide? Boniface, maybe I can start with you on this.
Well, I think WHO has always been an institution that provides recommendations for good practice and for advice on anything to do with access to medicine. So I think they still have an opinion about what regulators can do and what industries can do in terms of strengthening the harmonization agenda, because I think they also see the value in creating that harmonization and close working relationship between industry and regulators. So I would say, simply put, that for me is what I would expect from WHO, is to provide any kind of recommendation, any kind of additional information that may not be available at country level in terms of strengthening systems. And I think Nene will be the first one to say that they receive a lot of support from WHO in terms of the functions of regulatory affairs, just like they receive from other regulators. So I would say the same service we see all the time from WHO continues even in this area of regulation. Thank you.
John, anything you would add on that?
Yes, I think, like Boniface said, WHO is such an important player for the continent, and a lot of work that WHO is doing here is really contributing to regulatory system strengthening agenda. And I cannot see a situation where we don't have this kind of support coming from WHO. So that leadership role that WHO takes and holds the hands of the various stakeholders in the continent towards the whole agenda for regulatory system strengthening, I foresee that this will continue, and I think it's a welcome move to continue that way.
So we have a question on pharmaceutical wholesalers, importers, and choices being made around where the profits are, right? Where, bringing products to countries based on their expected revenue potential, their profitability, which, is in the nature of industry. Is there any comment that you might have around whether you see this as actually restricting access to needed products, or is there anything that regulators are seeking to do to manage around it? And Mimi, maybe I'll start with you.
And maybe the first thing I should say is that regulators currently in our region, and I think I speak for most, don't actually have much to do with profits or price. We purely focus on quality, safety, and efficacy. But what I think is, I'm not sure what goes into profits or price, but I know that if you have a system that is level, you have a level playing field, and it is not any more difficult, or you're not spending any more resources doing something in one country than you're doing it in another, then for most of us, if you, as John said, one document for Africa, I'm not sure where this where there'll be price differences depending on where you're taking a product to, because we did not give you the hassle bringing the product in or getting the product ready to come in. And therefore, I think with looking at things like AFCFTA and where taxes and everything are going to be leveled, there should be really no issue on the cost of a product in one jurisdiction as compared to another, because when that happens, it also allows, and there's also going to be free movement of goods from one place to another. So price becomes will become a barrier for importers if they have different pricing models depending on the country. And it could be a deterrent, or it could be detrimental for us, because then there will be a force to move products from where it is cheapest to a place where it is more expensive. And I don't think that is really fair. But really on the surface, for us regulators, we are promising to ensure that it is a hassle-free experience to get your product onto every market. And therefore the thought, and we are doing this to ensure availability and access has to do with pricing. So I don't think there should be an issue of now, talking about pricing and profits. I mean, profits are fine, but it should be level not depending on where it's going. So that is what I can say.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I think let me turn it back over for closing remarks.
Oops. Thanks, Leah. This is Jeff Sturcio. I'm the chairman of the Corporate Council on Africa. It's been terrific to listen to this lively and very informative discussion about the efforts at regulatory harmonization on Africa and how this will help to accelerate access to medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics for people all over the continent. I just have a couple of thoughts and no real conclusions, but just a couple of thoughts on the conversation we've heard so far and some of the takeaways for us. As with so much else, the COVID-19 pandemic has really uncovered bottlenecks in our processes for gaining rapid regulatory approval for new medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics. Luckily for Africa, as we've heard, there had already been efforts underway to bring regulatory harmonization to the continent. And we've heard from our panelists, through Leah's capable moderation, we've heard from Mimi and Boniface and John, the efforts that have been underway from the point of view of the Africa Resource Center, the Ghanaian FDA, and the African Regulatory Network from IFPMA, so an industry perspective on some of those efforts. And it's interesting to think of and this is an odd way of putting it, but there was sort of a silver lining in the cloud of the COVID pandemic, because it really served as a catalyst to these harmonization efforts. So we've heard about the important changes that have been made and some of the innovations that have been introduced, such as risk-based submissions and rolling submissions, and also the importance of the heightened collaboration between industry and regulatory agencies. We can summarize the lessons that have been learned together, as Boniface put it, under 5 general areas, and those are collaboration, as I mentioned. That collaboration has built confidence and trust that more can be done along these lines. The collaboration has also led to the building of capacity on many of the technical areas of regulatory review. And also there's been a reassessment and a realignment of where the competencies for certain decisions arise. And I think Mimi, for instance, pointed to the ways in which regulatory agencies are working together now so that they can share their best practices and really do a much more efficient job of both the initial regulatory review. And then the 5th heading is consultation. We've heard about those kinds of consultations between regulatory agencies, between the WHO and the regulators in Africa, between industry and the regulators. And there's been important and extended consultation on everything from post-marketing surveillance to digitalization, and to understanding the implications of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which will provide a unified single market for Africa. It's also important to have the same kind of harmonization in regulatory review for medicines, which will then enable countries on the continent to take advantage of that the continental market as well in medicines as in other areas. So those are just some of the thoughts that occurred to me as I listened to the themes from this conversation. On behalf of the Corporate Council on Africa, I just want to thank again our moderator, Leah Kaplow, and Mimi and Boniface and John, our excellent panelists. And also I want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in this discussion. So that concludes the session, and thank you all very much.